Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture by Professor Douglas North. Now, before anything else, can I, if you don't mind, actually request and after that insist that you either switch off your cell phones or put them on the silent mode. I say that because it's becoming a rather bad habit in Singapore to have cell phones ringing in the middle of a lecture, and it is rather distracting, so I really encourage you to switch it off. Now, those of you who've heard me make introductions before know that I always begin by saying that I follow the advice of my guru, Professor Tommy Koh, and I make 3 points. Today, for the first time, I'm going to discard Tommy Koh's 3 points because I think 3 points would do great injustice to our speaker, who's truly a remarkable, I would call him a true Renaissance man. And I want to go into some detail into his life story, if only because it goes against the entire Singapore model of how you are supposed to succeed in life, you know. In the Singapore model, you must get into the right primary school, the right secondary school, go to the right university, get A's, get scholarships and all that. And guess what? When I read to you the story of Professor Douglas North, you'll find that he would not succeed in Singapore. Let me begin by illustrating how colorful his life history was. As a young boy, he lived a nomadic life. He actually was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where, as you know, where Harvard is. But because of his father's business, he had the opportunity to live and study in different parts of the United States, Europe, and Canada. Now, as he says in his own autobiography, both his parents did not complete their high school education, but both believed in the value of good education. And when he was young, Professor Douglas North had decided that his mission in life was to be a photographer. And so he won as a high school student the first, third, fourth, and seventh prizes in an international competition for college and high school students. And when he came to college, he actually was offered a place in Harvard. But being very un-Singaporean, he chose to go to the University of California in Berkeley to be close to his family. And according to his autobiography, this is from your record, his record at the University of California as an undergraduate was only slightly better than a C average, although he did have a triple major in political science, philosophy, and economics. Now, in between his academics, he also became a Marxist and actively participated in liberal student activities. And because he was a pacifist, he chose not to fight in World War II, and instead he joined the Merchant Marine. And when he joined the Merchant Marine, I learned that as soon as he got on board the first ship going from San Francisco to Australia, the captain said to him, "We have no navigator. Can you navigate the ship?" And of course he did, in the beginning of World War II. And then he sailed back and forth from San Francisco to Australia and in the front lines in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Now, during the 3 years that he was a navigator in World War II, he spent his time reading and concluded then that he wanted to become an economist. And while on board the ship, he also mastered a very important skill, which is now encouraged in Singapore, by the way. He also mastered the game of poker, winning a total of $2,500, which, as you know, was a huge sum in those days. Now, he claims that he won the games not because of strategy, but because of discipline. His opponents were drunk and intoxicated, and he was sober. Whenever there was an air raid, he was the only one sober enough to collect the money. Then he bought a ranch with his winnings. Now, after the war, he went back to the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School, and this time he was clear what he wanted to do. He decided no more photography. He decided to improve societies worldwide. It was clear to him that the way to do this was to find out what made economies work the way that they did or failed to work. He believed that once we had an understanding of what determined the performance of economies through time, we could then improve their performance. And till today, he remains committed to the idea of how do we improve societies, and I hope you'll get a glimpse of that in his lecture too. Now, in graduate school, as he says, his worldviews were shaped by highly influential professors. However, he admits that he did not quite understand formal economic theory as he learned them through rote learning, but it was from his friend with whom he played chess that he learned to reason like an economist, which is, according to him, one of the most important skills he had acquired. Indeed, throughout his long career, he had applied economic reasoning not only to questions of economic growth, but over time to historical and sociological issues such as the role of culture, how politics affects economics, and how economics affects politics. A defining moment in his career came in 1956, which is exactly 52 years ago, when he was invited as a research fellow at the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, where he met leading economists. NBER is the United States leading economic research organization. 16 of the 31 American Nobel Prize winners in economics and 6 of the past chairmen of the U.S. President's Council of Economic Advisors have been researchers at the NBER. Subsequently, Professor North became a member of the board of directors of NBER, where he became very influential in shaping the field of economic history. He also became convinced then that the tools of neoclassical economic theory were not up to the task of explaining the kind of fundamental societal change that had characterized European economies from medieval times onwards. And it was in this long search for new analytical tools that he became interested in the subject of new institutional economics. In 1993, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics along with Bob Fogel for revitalizing the field of economic history and for his work in new institutional economics. Now, a more important fact for you all to know is that in the past 20 years, he has also been asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he has got his nominations right 100%. In fact, one of his nominees, Professor Tom Schelling, won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005. Those of you who want to apply, please apply to him for a nomination. Interestingly, and he may not be fully aware of this, Professor North has also played an important intellectual role in shaping the agenda of schools of public policy, that is to put the subject of good governance into the curriculum and research agenda of schools of public policy. Indeed, worldwide efforts to define and measure good governance trace its intellectual roots to the new institutional economics of which Professor North is an acknowledged leader. Now, he often uses a sports analogy to distinguish between institutions, governance, organizations, and public policy as a useful way to differentiate these concepts and make them meaningful. Now, sports analogies are supposed to make things simple and easy for you to understand, right? Now, I'm going to read the next 4 lines, and if you don't understand, don't worry, neither did I when I first read it. Now, this is the sports analogy he uses. He says, for instance, he says that institutions are the formal and informal rules of the game, including their enforcement mechanisms. That's institutions. Organizations are the players of the game, including those who make, interpret, and enforce rules. Governance is how the game is played. And public policies are the outcome of the game. Now that's very simple and clear, right? But that actually gives you a remarkable example of the complexities of the ideas that Professor North has dealt with. And from a school of public policy, his ability to bring together all the different strands in one comprehensive theory is a great gift. I should also add here that Professor North's advice on political and economic reform is frequently sought after around the world. He has advised governments in Latin America, transition economies in Europe and in China. And indeed, the World Development Report in 2002 was dedicated to the subject of building institutions for market, and Professor North was quoted high in that report. His forthcoming book actually is the subject of our lecture today. It is an important contribution, it will be an important contribution to the field of political economy. And I hope, as he will elaborate today, economics and public policy are intricately linked to politics and vice versa. And indeed, in our School of Public Policy, we would like to see greater interconnectedness between the studies in economics, politics, law, and other areas, and that's what he emphasizes too. Now, the final point I want to make about him is that he's still a very young man. At 87 years old, Professor North is still going strong. He says that his secret to success is good wine every lunch or dinner. Now, I saw this on Monday when, after a very brilliant seminar he gave at the Institute of Policy Studies, Professor Tomiko took him out for lunch at a Japanese restaurant, and he said, "I don't eat Japanese food without sake." So he drank a whole bottle of sake and then went on his way to meet the minister mentor, Lee Kuan Yew, after that. He also has a good sense of humor, a loving wife, Elizabeth Case, who's here, who's also a strong intellectual partner, and a very strong sense of mission to improve societies. I am pleased to report that the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy shares many of these characteristics. We love good wine. We hope we have a sense of humor, and we certainly have a mission to inspire leaders and improve lives. And I hope all this will come true when Professor North addresses us today. Professor North, over to you.
I don't think I need to say anything after that introduction. He's covered it all, including almost all the intellectual ideas I've got. But that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. What I'm going to talk about is what we don't understand. We don't understand something that is so obvious and so clearly necessary that it's very peculiar. In fact, we spent more than $150 billion trying to get economic development around the world, and so far, without a great deal of success. Now that's a puzzle. And it's a puzzle because we know the sources of what makes economies rich. It's very straightforward. You get rich if you become more productive, so you produce more output per man hour, per time, and that essentially is the backbone and heart of what is economic development. We also know the institutions, and my friend here gave you a definition of institutions, so I don't have to say anything more about them, but I'm going to. Because we know that it requires that you have well-defined property rights, effective judicial system, and things like that. They're not some things we know, all know. Now, if we know the sources of economic growth and the way and the kind of institutional structure that is necessary to get it, what's missing? We don't know how to get it. Economics, political science, sociology, and you're going to hear all three from me, are static disciplines that explore very narrowly their own particular field. What you're going to get from me is a mixture of all of them, because I think that you can't understand how a society works unless you understand that all three of them are involved in trying to make sense out of our world. And even though you may understand that, the theory we have is static. That is, it's a theory. It's good. Economic theory is a powerful body of theory, but it explores how an economy works at a moment of time. It also assumes away all of the interesting things that we're concerned to try to understand, all of which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, what's missing? Well, first of all, beliefs, second of all, time, third of all, culture, and fourth of all, institutions. And I'm going to take each one in turn. Beliefs. How do we understand the world around us? Now, what economics inherited was from the physical sciences, physics and chemistry and so on. And they have very elegant bodies of theory in which get at fundamentals of what either genes or neurons or whatever. And whenever they run into a new problem, they go back to fundamentals, and then they build from that a theory about trying to deal and solve that problem. And that's been very powerful enough so we could fly to the moon and do all kinds of things as a basis of a body of theory that solves our problems. We don't have any such fundamentals in the social sciences. What we have is eyes, ears, nose, and feeling, and those are the only ways we understand the external world. That's all we understand. But how do we translate what I see or hear or feel into understanding the complex structure of human interaction that characterizes our world? Well, it happens in our brain. So the beginning of understanding is to ask ourselves, how does the brain take these things that come from the senses and translate it into a coherent explanation that allows us to understand who we are, where we are, what we're doing, what other people are doing? Now, if you think that's simple, you're wrong. We don't still know a great deal about cognitive science. We don't still know a great deal about the way in which the brain takes what you see or what you hear and inside your brain builds it into a structure to make sense out of the world around us. Why is that important? Well, that's important because we have different experiences in different parts of the world with different times. And those different experiences mean that the way we understand the world is not going to be the same for me as for you, as for you, as for you. It's going to be different. And indeed, that difference is at the heart of almost all of the problems in the world. If we all had the same experiences, we'd translate, presumably, the world the same way, and we'd have a common understanding of the world. But whether we're Americans, Muslim fundamentalists, or whatever, we've all had different experiences, and we translate it differently. So the beginning of being intelligent about how societies and economies and polities work is to understand that the beliefs that people have are a result of the way in which the brain has constructed and translated the senses into a particular structure and order. Okay? And that it's going to be different. Which takes me to the next thing. It's not only going to be different at a moment of time, it's going to change over time. Because the world we see today and the world we saw yesterday are different. And very different than the world of 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years ago. So not only is culture, something I'm going to come to in a minute, not only is culture going to differ with different experiences we have in different environments, but it's going to change over time. And what we mean by culture, is the beliefs and institutions that we've inherited from the past that structure human interaction today. Let me say that again because it's the heart of everything I'm going to say. Culture is the beliefs and institutions that have been inherited from the past that constrain the choice set, economic technical jargon, constrain the choice set in the present of people. Now, why is that important? Well, that's because you don't really have free will. You never did. What you've got is a world in which you're so constrained by the beliefs and the rules of the game and so on that you've got inherited from the past, that how you understand the world is not only differ in different environments, but it's going to change over time. Now, all of that's crucial because if we're going to understand the world, we've got to understand that this is the source of the kinds of differences that make for the conflicts that we see all the time, that make for the fact that we don't understand people in different environments, and that the world that we see is continually changing, and we're trying to understand that change as a dynamic process that's going on all the time. The way we translate it, those experiences, is institutions. Institutions are the way we structure human interaction. Now, if we didn't have institutions, we wouldn't know how to deal with each other. Instead, institutions define the structure that determines how I deal with my wife or any of you, why I'm up here translating and talking the way I am. Institutions, as my introducer made clear, is made up of formal rules, informal norms of behavior, and enforcement characteristics. Formal rules are straightforward. They're in the most liberal sense, they're property rights. But there are also any kinds of rules that are enacted by government, and it's usually by government, although I'll come to qualify that in a minute, that define the way in which overall the game is played. Informal norms are ways of doing things, values, and so on, that constrain the way in which we interact with each other. And in many respects, they're more important than the formal rules. After all, when I deal with my students or I deal with other faculty members or with anybody else, it's the way we deal with each other is neatly defined by all kinds of conventions, codes of conduct that define how we deal with each other. And most important of all, if you have institutions but they're not enforced, they don't make much difference. And all institutions are always imperfectly enforced. Let me give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. I'm going to apply it to professional team sports. You play football here, although what you call football and what we call football in the United States are different, but you can translate it easily enough. Football is made up of formal rules that define the way the game is supposed to be played. Informal norms, such as you're not supposed to break the quarterback's leg of the opposing team, or translate it into soccer, which is your football. You're not supposed to trip up the other guy and kick him in the shins and things like that. And enforcement, which is you have referees, umpires, and so on, whose objective it is to see that the rules are enforced. But I don't know about, probably here in Singapore, you're all very gentlemanly and ladylike, and therefore live by the rules. But in professional football in the United States, the Oakland Raiders won the world championships year after year by deliberately breaking the quarterback's leg on the opposing team because he was the key player, and if you did him in, why, you'd win. You say, what a horrible thing, but that's the way all societies work. All societies work on the basis of institutions and very imperfect enforcement. Now, why am I going at this so long? Well, because the way societies work, and that's what we're interested in, the way societies work is a function of the way institutions work. And while we try to make them work in a certain way, they never work ideally or perfectly that way. They work very imperfectly. So even the most effective institutional structure, one that produces as the Western world, very high income world, still has all kinds of defects and failures and so on. Now, one more introductory comment, and then I'm going to get to the crucial framework that I want to deal with, and that is violence. One of the things that distinguishes human beings from lots of other animals, but in which we have a close relationship with chimpanzees, but not bonobos, I might add, and that is we kill each other with great abandon. We've been doing it ever since the beginning of time. And because we are violent with each other, creating social order, creating a society that will work and provide a context within which human beings can interact, can deal peacefully and effectively with each other, has been an ongoing, continual dilemma of societies all through history. So violence is always a threat, and social order and peace and stability are very delicate. If you doubt me, I suggest you look at what happened to Iraq in the last 10 years. The United States wiped out a dictator in Iraq and didn't replace him with anything, at least not with anything that worked. Wiped out whatever you can say about Saddam Hussein. He did create order. He did create a system in which within that order, while you had political, economic, social activity going on, and once that got wiped out, it's not easy to replace. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about what I think is the fundamentals of the way in which societies have organized themselves all through history. There's just what I and my two colleagues who are writing this book call social orders. That is, there's just three fundamental ways throughout history that human beings have organized themselves. And when I say organize themselves, I mean produced institutional frameworks that structure the way the game is played very ineffectively, or at least sometimes ineffectively. The three social orders are primitive societies, which are only of historical interest, which is hunting and gathering societies, the natural state, or the limited access society, and open access society. Now, I'm not going to talk about the first, but I'm going to talk a lot about the natural state or limited access societies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about open access society. Note that the way in which I'm approaching the problem is very different than as an economic historian I was taught economic history, or as even I wrote economic history in earlier days. Economic history, and indeed societal change, has usually been talked about or written about in terms of technological change, the growth in the stock of knowledge, or demographic change, such as Malthusian pressures and fertility, mortality, migration. And there's no doubt these are very crucial, basic parts of what determines the way in which societies work. And they provide an underpinning frame of the way in which I think societies work. But what I focus on is on the way in which we structure social order and the effectiveness of doing that, and most crucial of all, the incentive structure that comes out of the way in which we structure social orders. And it's the incentive structure that determines the performance characteristics of societies. Because what's missing in lots of societies is that it does not pay for the players to be more productive, to be creative, to do the kinds of things that we know makes for productivity increase and makes for human well-being. So what we're looking at, therefore, is why we have societies in which the incentive structure of the social order is one that provides only limited or very poor incentives for people to be more productive. So let me talk about the natural state or the limited access society. It has dominated human history ever since the Neolithic revolution, which produced agriculture beginning in 8000 BC in Mesopotamia. Because that was the beginning of human beings settling down. It was the beginning of producing organized economic activity, of specialization and division of labor, the classic framework within which economics is built. And that framework was one that therefore led to completely fundamentally changing the potential well-being of human beings. And that social order still dominates most of the world today. Maybe 80 to 85% of the world still lives in a natural state. Now, what made the natural state so powerful, what made it such an effective system, was that it produced elites, political, economic, religious, social elites, that had a stake in preventing violence by cooperating with each other in such a way that they stood to gain by that cooperation and not fighting with each other. Now, let me give you a simple illustration. If you had a economic group, the elites in that economic group would provide support for the political group that ran the society, and that political group in turn would limit competition in that thing so that the economic group would capture rents. And indeed, the preservation of limited access, and that's what you mean by limited access, were worlds in which the players stood to become rich or influential by the fact that they captured rents, and while there was cooperation, there was competition, the competition was limited and effectively limited so that the elite groups stood to gain by preserving the rents of each other. Now, that's still the way most of the world is run. It's still the way most societies operate. It's a world in which elite groups survive and maintain social order in their self-interest by creating rents that are maintained. And it's a world in which personal exchange, that is, knowing the other person, is a key part of the way the game is played. Now, the natural state, or limited access societies, dominate the world for all this time, but they're very different in terms of how well they work. And indeed, we can define natural states in terms of a progression of natural states from very fragile ones to stable structures to mature natural states. And what defines the difference between first early part and the latter part is that fragile natural states are always in danger of violence. The elites are always threatened by other elites with different interests, and to preserve, therefore, and survive, they must maintain themselves by creating institutions and enforcement characteristics that is going to maintain their order, but do very little else. But as they become more stable over time, and they do, if they allow for the growth of economic activity, for example, which will lead to the growth of specialization, division of labor, the development of agriculture, the beginnings of manufacturing, services, and so on. As they become more elaborate, the institutional framework becomes more secure, and they become less dependent on violent state. A mature natural state is one, or limited access order, is one in which you have a quite elaborate structure of institutions and organizations that make for societies being quite well off. Quite well off, but you'll note the key feature of a natural state is that while you capture some of the potential gains of increasing specialization and division of labor, which from Adam Smith on has been the basis of increasing productivity, you don't capture it completely. Indeed, the fact that you allow for monopoly, rent-seeking, and limited competition means that you never capture the complete gains that you get from a society in which you had competition. I'm going to come back to the natural state, but that word competition leads me to the third kind of social order, which is an open access society. And open access societies are a recent development. They began in Western Europe, the Netherlands, Dutch first, and then the English, French, and gradually spread overseas possessions of the English and so on. And the open access society's key feature is that you have competition in both economic markets and in political markets. Now, that's crucial because if you have competition only in the economic market, why then some economist or some economic group that wants to preserve its rents, if it gets hold of the political system, will simply restrict entry and therefore maintain monopoly positions. And don't misunderstand me. Everybody would like to have a monopoly, including us academics more than anybody else. Because after all, a competitive world is a very insecure world. It's a world in which you never are secure, which you've got to continue to struggle and improve all the time. And indeed, the economic model of the world that I'm talking about was the one that Joseph Schumpeter most completely characterized as a world of creative destruction. And it's a good term, creative destruction, because creative destruction precisely was characterized. What you have is a world in which innovation, creation of new products, and persistently creating more innovation and new products is an ongoing process. An ongoing process that goes on forever. And because it does, it means that rents tend to be temporary. And because they're temporary, therefore, you wipe out monopolies. But you'll note that in the creative destruction part means that you can get very rich in this world, because if you invent a better method of doing things than your predecessor, you may wipe out the previous way of producing, but you'll have, until the next group catches up with you, you'll have high incomes and make substantial profits. That process of creative destruction that Joseph Schumpeter characterized beginning in the early 20th century is the key to an open access society. It's what made the world rich. And indeed, so much so that when you look at the contrast between limited access societies and open access societies, there's an enormous difference. Limited access societies, to use the jargon and the numbers of economists, typically have per capita income that does not exceed $10,000 per capita. Open access societies have per capita incomes that usually range anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 per capita. There's a big gap. Limited access societies are based on personal knowledge, personal exchange. Who you know is what counts. Open access societies are based on impersonal knowledge, the development of secure impersonal property rights, treating everybody equally, and indeed providing a framework in which the rule of law and a judicial system dominate the way in which the system works. To translate it into the jargon that we economists use, limited access societies have low costs of transacting in all kinds of markets, political, economic, social markets. And that means that you get the advantages of trade and exchange and economic growth in all kinds of different margins. And therefore, when we try as we do to measure the costs of exchange in different kinds of markets, we observe that in open access societies, it's very low. Because in fact, again, you have competition to do things more productively and creatively, and if somebody can do it more productively and creatively, as long as you have free entry into economic, political, and social activity, then that process is going to continue to grow. Now, at this point, I hope you're saying to yourself, well, why wouldn't all societies be open access societies? The obvious gains are so vast of open access society over limited access societies that clearly the advantages of one over the other are substantial. Now, don't misunderstand me. Limited access societies grow. After all, you can have economic development, and but it will be limited development. It will never be anything like what you can get with an open access society. So that when we observe limited access societies moving from fragile to stable to mature, they are progressing along a line in which they're gradually building more complex institutions, extending the rule of law in certain dimensions and so on. That is making it possible for them to be more productive. But they run up against fundamental obstacles as long as the game is played within the constraints of rent-seeking dominating the way in which elites deal with each other and protect each other's rents. Why is the limited access society so difficult to change? Well, because the elites that run limited access societies, which usually make up no more than 10 to 15 to 20% of the total population, the rest of the population are, they may have some rights, but they will certainly have less secure rights than the elite groups. Obviously, the elite groups stand to gain by maintaining the structure that provides the rents for them, which make them rich, and which provides a framework, therefore, that provides security for them, prevents violence and the disorder and so on, and therefore provides a basis that has provided a degree of social order for 10,000 years now. How do you move from a limited access society to an open access society? Obviously, you don't do so very easily for the very reason that the groups that run the social order of a limited access society is made up of elite groups that are interdependent and control and are related to each other. In order to destroy that and create an open access society, you've got to wipe out the monopoly rents that are the basis of the stable structure of that society. Now, once you understand that, you begin to understand why it's very difficult to move from one to the other, and indeed why World Bank and IMF and groups like that have attempted to improve the lot of poorest nations fail. They fail because the policies that work in an open access society, competition, secure property rights, and things like this, when you would apply them to a limited access society, are going to wipe out the rents in that society, and those rents are the framework, the basis for what prevents disorder and violence. So that the in order to move from a limited access society to an open access society, you've got to have change that goes on in such a way that the elite groups gradually transform themselves from one to the other, because it's to their self-advantage to do so. So let me give you a very brief sketch, and then I want to quit talking so that you have a chance to discuss things. What you have to have happen is, first of all, elite groups will, in their own self-interest, establish property rights, because that provides secure relationships as when they trade with each other. But gradually, they observe that they can extend profits by extending property rights to larger and larger groups. And as they do, obviously this widens the basis of exchange, and therefore the profits and rents that they can get. Gradually, this creates institutions and organizations that become to some degree autonomous and independent of the elite groups. And to the extent it does, these organizations take on a framework of their own and make possible wider and wider potential profits. The development of trade and commerce and exchange groups therefore becomes gradually independent of government ownership. And indeed, with a limited access society, the organizations that are created as creatures of the government. But that limits your ability to capture lots of profits when trade and markets can expand. And so gradually, limited access societies can, the elites in their own interest may expand trade and gradually, therefore, expand the range of activities that they will engage in. And that will lead them to more complex institutions and organizations that in turn become more and more independent of the control of the existing elites. So the first doorstep condition is that elites extend property rights. The second is that you extend them and create institutions and organizations that have a degree of autonomy from them, which allows them to operate in ways that will gradually undermine the monopoly position of elites. And third of all, and last, you've got to have, as a third doorstep condition, that the military comes under civilian control. Of all the things that have characterized limited access societies is when elites get in trouble, they have called in the military to put down disorder or put down conflict in their own self-interest, and therefore the military has always been at the beck and call of elite interests. Somehow or other, you've got to get elites which gradually, military which becomes gradually increasingly independent of such control. Now, this has happened, and indeed in the book we've just finished, we have detailed stories about how this happened in Western Europe and in other parts of the world, and why it hasn't happened, and what the obstacles to it happening are in limited access societies like Mexico or countries like this. But obviously it happens, and as it does happen, it gradually transforms the nations, one nation from a limited access to an open access society, and one that goes from personal exchange to impersonal exchange, and one that realizes the potential, therefore, of productivity that's inherent in a world of competition of the kind that I'm describing. Well, we still don't know a lot about the process, and the reason why we don't is that while social order has certain key features that I've tried to describe, the specifics of every society are different because they have a different cultural heritage. To take just one illustration of many that I could give you, take China, which is still a limited access society, but evolving very rapidly. But the way in which China evolved, the kind of institutional change that has been responsible for the dynamic process that's going on in China that's moving it from fragile to a mature natural state, has been one that doesn't look anything like what happened in the West. In the West, we see the development of property rights, the growth of firms, the growth of judicial systems. If you look at China, it begins with a transformation of the rights of peasants to receive a greater proportion of their income for themselves, and then the creation of town village enterprises and local villages, which certainly didn't look like firms as existed in the West, and on and on. So what you have, therefore, is every country is unique. The cultural heritage is different. They have different culture, and because they have the way in which they're going to evolve is going to be specific to that particular society. Now, the reason why this is important, of course, is because while there's generalizations about the characteristics of one social order versus another, and certainly with an open access society, it means you have competition, secure property rights, impersonal exchange. But how you get there is going to be specific to each particular country with a particular cultural heritage that it has, the particular institutions it has. And if you don't understand that, obviously you're going to not understand how to transform that society to make it work well. What works is transforming China. It's very different than what works and is transforming India today, and what's worked and what is still far away from being transformed, places like Haiti or very primitive natural states like that. Everywhere they're different. Well, this is the framework for our study because it suggests clearly why when we try to improve societies, we have such a difficult time doing it. The way to improve a society is not to try to apply the principles that work in an open access society, but instead to try to incrementally change the institutional framework of the natural state so that it works better and moves it in the direction of the doorstep conditions that will eventually allow it to become an open access society. Now, let me say in conclusion, I don't mean to imply that open access societies are ideal and limited access societies are terrible. They're not. Limited access societies have many virtues, and indeed some of them work very well within the limits imposed. And open access societies are subject to all kinds of constraints that I don't like. And indeed, open access society, if you ask me where they're going, it's a good question. We're creating a world which has no parallel with anything that existed in the past. It's a new, unique world. And to the degree that it's going to continue, it's got to continue by our understanding what's happening to us, and which is an ongoing process. Because I'm going to conclude with my favorite term, which always gets everybody to run to the dictionary. It's a non-ergodic world. Now, an ergodic world would be one in which there's a fundamental underlying structure to the system, so that if you understand that structure, you'll always get it right when you try to deal with the problems. And economics always assumed it was an ergodic world, and they're wrong. It's a non-ergodic world. We're evolving a world of economic, political, and social institutions that has no parallel with anything that ever existed before, which is continually evolving and changing, and in which, therefore, the kind of policies that will work and be effective in making it work better in time t are not going to be necessarily the same things that will work in time t plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4. And so what we're facing all the time is not only that the world is changing and we've got to understand that world, but how do we understand a world that keeps on evolving of this kind? Well, the only way we can hope to understand it is by, since it's new and novel, is by experimentation, by trial and error. We can hope to understand it by keeping on, when we run into a new problem, trying out different kinds of policies to see how well they work. And if you think I'm saying something that doesn't have immediate relevance, take something as simple as how the international capital market works today as contrasted with yesterday and the day before yesterday. Things like the internet, zero-cost information, and technological change associated with the computer have completely transformed the degree to which capital movements can occur in ways that were never imagined. And in fact, if you go back to looking at earlier times, and you start with the telegraph, which is the beginning of rapid, low-cost information transmitted instantly or almost instantly, and look at the succession of things that have occurred, you observe that just with that one technological dimension is transforming our world in extraordinary ways all the time. So if we're going to understand the world, we got to keep on trying to experiment and see what works, and discard things that don't work. And if we continue to do that, we have the prospect that we'll continue to survive in a world that is still a violent world. Thank you.
Well, I thought you were going to end on an optimistic note and say that world peace is coming. Instead, you say we still live in a violent world.
It still is.
Before I throw the floor open for questions, let me just ask you the first question. Okay? You mentioned that you were once a Marxist. You know, as you know, Marx, you said we do not know where we are going. Marx had a very clear idea of where we are going. He said we're going to have the withering away of the state. We'll all be completely free. We can fish in the morning, write poetry in the afternoon, hunt in the evening. In your future, you see that institutions are going to be eternal. There'll be no withering away of the state. In fact, the state will continue to play a bigger role forever. So if Marx was here, what would you say to him about why his vision was wrong?
Well, I'd say if Marx asked all the good questions, you didn't get very good answers. And I mean that because the reason why Marx was so impressive was that Marx came along at a time when we didn't have any good dynamic process of change theory, and he had such a theory, of the stage theory, feudalism, capitalism to socialism, and he had technological change being the engine, and class groups being the actors. Well, all of those were very useful concepts. They just were much too simple to deal with the world we live in. I mean, take the actors. Classes aren't the actors typically. Typically, it's much more groups of elites or of different kinds that play a role in transforming the society. So what we've tried to do, and what I've tried to do in evolving from Marxism, is not to throw it out, because I think it's a very valuable way to think about problems, but to translate it into a dynamic process that seems to fit the kind of evidence we have about how societies work, again, how social orders work, and how institutions work. What Marx understood was that the incentive structure was crucial. And that, I think, is terribly important. What has been missing from economists have always thought of it as a world in which there's incentives are always there. In fact, it's a world of zero transaction costs. There's no cost of exchange. There's no cost of activity. And so that was missing most of the fundamental things that we're trying to build into a framework that's trying to make sense out of our world.
Great. Okay, question time. Please come to the mic and introduce yourself and pose a short, sharp question. Professor North likes to be challenged, by the way, so don't hesitate, okay? The more you challenge him, the happier it is. But just come to the mic and... Okay, we start with the handsome gentleman in the back there. Please introduce yourself.
Stavros Yanuka, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. One potential flaw in your theory, which you could say you can share with Marxism, is that it runs the risk of being very linear. It implies a certain progression from primitive to various stages of natural state and on to the open access society that you speak of. Another potential way of looking at it, though, is that history fluctuates between various natural states, occasionally interrupted by open access societies, until you get to a situation where a new group of elites form, and then by definition they will revert to the natural state of wanting to have limited access. So what is your view of that counter theory?
That's a good question, because one of the things that we have asked ourselves in writing this book, do nations fall back from being open access societies back to limited access to natural states? So far, we don't observe that. Now, I'm going to qualify that in a minute. But take a country that's very close to fitting that particular framework, which is Argentina, which I've spent a lot of time advising the government of Argentina. And Argentina was the sixth highest income country in the world in 1940. By 1980, it had fallen to third world status and had stagnated. And then it had a spurt of rapid improvement. But now it's falling back again into disorder. Now, was it ever an open access? Well, it was very close to it, whether it was or not. But it comes close enough to making the point that it seems to me we would expect to see societies fall back into limited access orders. And certainly one of the things that I hope you'll challenge me on is no society that we call open access is completely open access. In the United States, we have all kinds of rents in agriculture and groups that maintain monopolies. But the basic heart of the open access society is still one in which effective competition dominates the way in which the system works, even if there's all kinds of exceptions to it. And I think that's true. Now, whether that is so embedded into the institutional framework that you can't fall back depends on whether you can get control of the polity, and the political system is the key, not the economics. I mean, if you get control of the polity so that you limit entry and so you can maintain your monopoly privileges, then you're going to go back to a natural state. We don't see that too often, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
Gentleman in front here.
I'm Shin Levine from Singapore Management University, and I've been a fan since my first year in graduate school when I read your seminal work on institutions. And as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, what an insightful sociologist. I was disappointed later to find out that you were not a sociologist, but I'm still fascinated by the work. And there's a particular side of it that I'm interested in. And let me quote, "We form mental models to explain and interpret the environment. Thus, the mental models may be continually redefined with new experiences, including contacts with others' ideas." And this is from the back end of Understanding the Process of Economic Change, your 2005 book. And I'm interested in the question of how notions, ideas, concept of institutions flow between individuals, between regions, between countries. How do you see the initiation of institution and their spread throughout societies?
Do I have 10 hours?
You have 10.5 seconds. And you better be brilliant, okay?
What? No, but that's I mean, the deep underlying framework that this book is built on around how mental models evolve, how they get constructed in our brains, and how they change, our mental models change with new experiences or with things that happen that are not consistent with the mental models. And that's the heart of what supposedly is the way in which change is going on all the time. So you've asked, the key question that the book is written about, but doesn't lend itself to talking about in 10, 15, 20, or 30 minutes. We spend several hundred pages dealing with that process. I'm not begging the question, it's just that I can't go into the details. I mean, just take something as simple as conflicting views about how the brain works. And I'll give you just one simple illustration. There's a general view by a lot of cognitive scientists, the brain works like your computer, so that the software in your head is exactly like a computer. Now, that means it's orderly, stable, and logical. But one of the things we've observed about the way in which human beings interpret evidence and build frameworks is it tends to be impressionistic, and it tends to have a process that we see a certain structure existing, and we tend to use that structure for different kinds of problems. And when we do that, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. For example, to take a simple illustration, economics was founded on the basis of physics. And the principles and the logic and structure and organization were inherited and taken over from that set of principles. Well, the same is true any time we try to understand something in the world. We tend to take some orderly structure that fitted over here and apply it over here. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But that involves some very complex assumptions we make about how the mind and brain are working that we certainly can't go into here. It's a good question.
And this is true for the spread of institution, or the attempt to take institutional structures from one place and apply them somewhere else.
That gets still another set of issues, which is, if you have institutions that work in country A, are they transportable and can they be transposed into country B? Sometimes they can. Depends again on how the institutions are, on the flexibility of the institutions, and on the degree to which the change in the institution is consistent with the belief system that varies with different systems. For example, one of the things that is of immediate issue of interest to us here in this room and everywhere is the degree in which Islamic fundamentalism can be transformed into something that hopefully is less violent, more peaceful. And we don't have good answers to that at this point, but it's right up the alley of the issues you and I are concerned with, because if we're going to have peace in the world, we can't do it in ways that we in the United States tend to do, which is to kill off people who disagree with us, which we seem to be very good at. Instead, we better find ways to understand. But that doesn't mean we've got to give in. It means we've got to understand them, so we understand the basis of differences, and we can start to then build a bridge to communicate effectively with each other. And so the whole framework that I'm trying to develop is one that tries to get at fundamentals that I think are crucial for, in the long run, solving problems.
So the 10-second answer is buy the book. Over to you over there.
Hi, my name is Richard Carney. I'm from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.
Wow, we're getting all the schools here.
And I think, like many of us here, I've been a big fan since graduate school especially. And I wanted to ask you a question that's kind of related, I guess, to the question that was just asked. You defined culture as being comprised of beliefs and institutions. And I wanted to ask you if you could define more precisely what you meant by beliefs, because it seems to me that it could be, on the one hand, the preferences that individuals or groups have. It could also be knowledge in the sense of understanding what works and what doesn't work. And just to elaborate just a little bit, if you're talking about groups having enough power to overthrow the elites, then it strikes me as more likely that the individuals in that group are unlikely to have the same level of knowledge, but would more likely share the same kinds of preferences. So does beliefs depend more upon the preferences that the individuals of a group share rather than their level of knowledge? Or what do you mean by beliefs?
Oh boy.
You only get easy questions here, don't worry.
Yeah, I got another five hours here. Beliefs consist of the way we understand what's going on, and they're not only made up of our understanding, but they always have an implicit understanding of what is and by contrast what should be. I mean, when we construct our world, it's not independent of saying, well, this is the way the world works, and once you understand the way the world works, then you also implicitly have an assumption about what will or won't work. Now, part of that is preferences, that is what you'd like to have, and how you relate preferences to beliefs is very complex, and indeed something we still don't know a great deal about. In economics, we used to take preferences as given and assume that therefore they were outside of economic reasoning. But Gary Becker, who was one of the sort of architects really of trying to transform a lot of the way in which we understand the world, and although he's a good Chicago economist, so he's kind of limited in how he does it, nevertheless woke up one day and decided that preferences were something we ought to take into consideration. Because if you don't take into consideration preferences, you can't understand a lot of the changes going on, which are preference change. People's views about what ought to be changing. And again, preferences may be derived from practical experience. That is, you observe something, you don't like the way it works, and so it changes your preference. Or it may be independent of specific activities and have evolved as an intellectual process, and like what came out of the Renaissance and modern development. Take a simple illustration. Until the late 18th century, it was not held generally that slavery was immoral. But starting in the 18th century, we began to think it was immoral for one human being to own another human being. Now that evolved as a set of changes in preference that really became a very powerful influence on the way in which actions took place and led eventually to the elimination of slavery around the world. So preferences come about either for intellectual activities or by experiences in which we run up against the way things work, and we don't like the way they work, and they change our attitudes. So that's not a very good answer, but we don't have good answers to it.
Thank you. The gentleman up there, please.
Hi, I'm Chen Yan from, I'm an editor with Asia 360. Well, you've obviously raised many issues, and I just want to kind of, since I'm from Singapore and I sense that you've been hesitant in trying to comment about the host country. And at least from some of the features you've described of a limited and an open society, we could see maybe perhaps Singapore veering from stable to towards probably mature limited societies. But I'm not sure to what extent these categories are really helpful. I mean, essentially it seems that the distinguishing factor between limited and open is competition. If there is political competition, if there's economic competition, then it's good. It lowers transaction costs and all that. But surely that in itself is not an end point. I mean, it really depends from country to country and society to society. Political competition for what purpose? And for the purpose of stability, for the purpose of greater political diversity, or even in terms of economic competition. I mean, we know that countries have different stages of economic development, and competition for a country which is very backward may not necessarily be a good thing. You probably want to protect it. You perhaps want to actively create a rent-seeking capitalist class to kind of, jumpstart your private sector. and also the assumption that the political elite or the economic elite invariably tends to be rent-seeking. But we know, as you have mentioned, we have this very complex issue of culture and beliefs. And arguably, in Singapore, at least I'm sure many of my compatriots share this view, is that the elite in Singapore, perhaps, well, maybe up to this point, we don't know what happens in the future, has not been terribly rent-seeking. It has been guided by other beliefs about nation building or creating cohesive society. So how do you fit that into what you have just discussed as obviously a very rough sketch of what is contained in greater detail in your book? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but let me state the way I think I understand it and see if I'm first of all, there's no normative judgment in what I'm talking about whether it's good or bad. I'm trying to get at what makes societies and economies materially well off versus those that remain poor. And that's a straightforward question. It does not imply that being rich is good or being poor is bad. It does imply that there's a universal desire on the part of populations around the world to get better off. And indeed, that's reasonable. Now, don't misunderstand me. All competition is not necessarily good. I've made competition the basic framework of an open access society. But to give an illustration that is one of my favorite ones, although not necessarily of the author of this illustration, I had a very good friend in the Soviet Union who was a banker. And when the Soviet Union was transforming itself with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, in 1980s to 1991, why, I remember talking to him, and he said, "Oh, it's going to be great, Doug." He said, "We're going to have competition, and the world's going to be great." And the next year, when I saw him right after the Soviet Union had disappeared and become Russia, I said, "Well, how are things going?" He said, "Well," he said, "we have competition," but he said the competition is in banking is you kill your competitor. And he said, it's not clear that that's an ideal kind of competition. I might have got killed the next year. So that it's not, when you talk about competition, you mean competition that is constrained at all kinds of margins. When Adam Smith, who was our patron saint, talked about the dynamics of competition in the world, he always made it an unmitigated good, but it's only an unmitigated good if you constrain the players so that they compete in ways that make it more productive and creative, but don't do things like kill your competitor. Well, all of the terms that I've used need to be much more carefully qualified when you start to think about what you mean by a structure that and how it works. And I haven't had time to do that very effectively.
So on Singapore, what would you say? One line on Singapore?
What?
I think he wanted to give you. He wanted you to say one line on Singapore.
One line about Singapore? It's a great place.
Oh, great.
Is that enough of a line?
I think we stop there. Okay, next question.
I'm Tatiana Rosito with the Embassy of Brazil in Singapore. Thank you for a very enlightening lecture. First, I would like you to comment on the possible impact of international or multilateral organizations on different nation states, natural states. Because it seems that or at least since we've been thinking about development more formally since Second World War, only a few countries have made it from natural states to open access societies, and they are in Asia. So this is one part. And the other part is to what extent that these multilateral organizations have been facilitating or actually hindering this. You hinted at the World Bank in the beginning, but then during the lecture you haven't gone back to that. So I would like you to elaborate on this if possible.
I didn't get you.
So the question was about the United Nations and multilateral organizations and the role that they have played.
To which extent United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, WTO, have actually facilitated or actually hinder this the transition, if this is possible, the transition from a natural state to an open access society?
Well, I don't think the UN has played much of a role. What the UN's most positive role has been is trying to reduce conflict around the world, and to the extent that they have, it's a very, very effective means of extending, really, but they have not played a role really in transforming natural states into open access societies, at least not to my knowledge. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have deliberately been concerned with that issue. That is, their objective has been to try to make societies more productive, and while they haven't used the terms I'm using, limited access society, although I might add the World Bank is in the process of adopting our framework, and so that they're going to in the future probably use it. But they haven't been concerned with, and what we've tried to do is try to develop a framework so that you can incrementally improve the performance characteristics of natural states, and eventually move them to the doorstep conditions that they could become open access society. And the heart of my argument has been you can't do that automatically, immediately. It's a gradual process, and it's one that's fraught with danger, because if you try to impose conditions on a natural state, you may make it so that it loses its cohesion and the things that hold it together, and as a result, you get violence and disorder.
Thank you. Last question from our lady.
Hi, I'm Yeling from the Center on Asia and Globalization. My question is on international cooperation. In a world where a lot of the problems we face today are global, do you think that open access states can work together with limited access states to come to a solution that makes everyone better off, or will we be crippled by the most fragile and most violent states? Or do you think that in a world that's globalizing very rapidly, we are developing global mental models and shared beliefs that transcend nation boundaries, which will help us deal with the global challenges of today?
Well, globalization is something that we're all for, at least we economists are all for. But it's a two-edged sword. Globalization is not without its dangers. Globalization, on the one hand, produces improved overall economic well-being, since free trade, no economist is ever going to argue that free trade and free movement of goods, services, and people in the world would not improve material well-being. But when you start to look at it in detail, and particularly look at the political instability generated by some things that are parts of a globalization process, then it's not clear that, again, you can do this without creating disorder and violence on certain margins. So I guess what I would say is that what I would like to see is globalization, but proceeding in a way that was self-conscious at every step along the way, about whether you're destabilizing societies so that they work more poorly because you've undermined the thing that made the natural state in these societies work and provide us some degree of order and stability. And that's something, again, that we know very little about. One of the things that is the heart of what we're trying to do in this book and in the work I'm doing with a group of people is trying to understand the dynamic process of change. And one of the things that is crucial about understanding that dynamic, to the extent that we do understand it, is the delicacy with which order and stability persist in the world. And this is particularly true in a world where we've managed to create weapons of such enormous destructive ability. Not only, I'm not talking just about nuclear weapons, but also all kinds of weapons that make it so that terrorism is such an effective tool. Things like that are going on all the time, and we don't understand what kinds of things will encourage or discourage those kinds of things are occurring. We don't know that. I mean, one of the things that I'm impressed with, I've been impressed with since a number of people have spent time since I've been here in Singapore talking about it, and talking about this phenomenon not only in Islamic world of the Near East, but the Islamic world in South Asia and so on, is the degree to which terrorist prospects can tend to undermine and threaten stability, order, and progress that is going on in various parts of the world. We just don't know enough about those things. But we do want to be self-conscious about it, because while economic improvement is certainly something that we're, at least as an economist, I'm for, I want to be sure I can do it without creating more disorder in the world, and that's a neat trick.
You know, I did say last question, but there's something about the natural state of lectures, whereby the questions always come at the end. So would you mind if we take the last three questions? Do you mind?
You're the boss. I'm at your disposal.
I'm a big shot now. Okay, I suggest that we take all three questions, if you don't mind, quickly. And if you want to take notes, then we can answer them all together. So that I don't want to detain Professor North. He's used his voice a lot, so I think we want to not strain his voice too much. So I'm going to take three quick questions in that order, and then give Professor North the last word, and then hopefully we can end not too late after 7. Please.
Thank you very much. My question will be very short. My name is Mushisi from a beautiful country called South Africa. I'm an MPP junior with the LKY SPP. And Prof. Douglas, thank you for an interesting account of different states and how those societies and different states impact on the economy. And bearing in mind, as you obviously did, that each and every society is different. And but also coming from Africa, and when I grew up in a society that was giving, a society that cares about the other person and not necessarily being driven by profit or such interest. Now, at least when I was growing up. Now, today, those kind of societies are very limited or completely wiped out by different kinds of societies. Do you think they can be regained, or is it necessary to regain such societies? Thank you.
His question is, he grew up in a society that was very giving, very compassionate. Can we go back to giving, compassionate societies instead of what we have today, which are less giving and less compassionate societies?
We do have less compassionate society? I thought he was talking about Africa. You're talking about Africa, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Okay, next question. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. I'm an accounting student from a local university. Forgive me if I'm asking something stupid. Okay, my question is, creative destruction is caused by the emergence of new ideas in the national innovation system. So how is economic growth generated by new ideas reflected in your emphasis on the framework of institutions in an open exercise society? Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Last one. This is definitely the last one, by the way.
India meets all the three criteria of...
You got to identify yourself.
Preeti Davra at the Lee Kuan Yew School. India meets all the three criteria of open access societies that you have described. And it always has, actually, since its independence. What would you attribute, other than increased competition, the tremendous growth that it is witnessing, and does culture have any role to play in this?
Could you translate?
That's a question about India. India has had all the characteristics of an open access society. The question is, what else does India need to have to succeed and modernize? Was that the last part of your question?
Actually, the question is, what has changed in India then, since it met the criteria, since its independence to now? What has changed in the past decade that has led to its tremendous growth, and does culture have any role in this?
Okay, why is India succeeding now? Yeah.
Okay, well, again, I got 10 hours for each of these.
Yes.
I'm not sure still I understand the question about Africa and compassion. But let me just say that if you look at performance characteristics of countries around the world, sub-Saharan Africa is right at the bottom. It has had negative growth in the last 20 years. so that people in sub-Saharan Africa are poorer today, absolutely, than they were 20 years ago. Now, that's very, very unusual because overall in the last 20 years, an enormous percentage of the world has grown, not very well, but they've grown. And also, poverty has been reduced substantially around the world. So Africa is the exception, and a very serious exception, and mostly because we have not understood how to break Africa out of the tribal heritage that it's had and transform it into a social order that would allow for improving productivity. In Africa, where the productivity growth is negative most of the time. Now, I have some very good friends that work in Africa, and if I had time, I'd give you their description of it. They start with the view that Africa has such enormous fluctuations in climate and soil and so on that it has been very difficult to develop orderly ways of producing that can realize it. Second of all, property rights are very imperfectly specified, and I can go on. I don't think I want to take too long. But just suffice to say that our experience in Africa is a dead loss at this point with respect to being able to improve performance. What generates economic growth? Well, economic growth is generated by new knowledge, by knowledge that gets us to understand better how to be more productive. And that new knowledge can be technological change, and this has been the dominant way economists have explained economic growth, is by technological change that has made us more productive by producing machinery and so on that replaces human hands and human minds with things that work much more productively. Or economic growth comes about by simply expanding the skill knowledge of people in a society and so on. So the sources of productivity we know a lot about. And we know a lot about the things by which human knowledge has been improved and transformed and made useful. To take just one simple example, the development of modern university knowledge applied to solving problems of scarcity is a relatively recent development about the last 150 years. It began in Germany in the late 18th, 19th century in the chemical industry, in which the Germans began to develop ways of making synthetic chemicals and using them for a variety of things. It had its expansion with countries in the United States with universities like MIT that combined chemistry and engineering to produce a whole new way of thinking about it. That's going on all the time. And but the fundamental underlying source, one is new knowledge, but two is developing institutions that implement that knowledge and apply it to solving human problems. And that's what we're interested in here. That's what the whole nature of a social order is, the degree to which it provides incentives to develop new knowledge and to use it effectively. India. Well, I don't know much about India. But I know enough to know that it's been, India, first of all, had the great advantage of British domination for maybe 100 years or so, and the disadvantage that imposed with respect to maintaining and perpetuating a set of political and social institutions that tended to rigidify Indian development and to encourage elite groups to perpetuate the way they did things. And it's only in the last 10, 15 years that gradually they're breaking down the rules and so on in India that's allowing for more effective and productive ways of producing. India is a classic case of a place where you had institutions that have encouraged inefficiency and failed to develop ways of improving productivity. That's been changing very rapidly in the last 8 or 10 years. So India now gradually is coming out. But it, for example, is not having nearly as rapid a progress as China has had, which has been much more open to rapid transformation of the institutional framework in the direction of providing for incentives for more increasing productivity. China is all by itself in that with respect to the rapidity of that process as compared to India.
Well, Professor North, there are two reasons why we're very grateful to you for giving this lecture. First, I'm sure you agree that we learned a great deal. I certainly feel that I have learned enough to definitely buy your book. So you have one customer and I think a few hundred other customers here for your book. But the second reason actually is a more important reason. I mean, we've tried very much to send the message in Singapore, because public policy education is still very new in Singapore, that public policy education is really the sunrise enterprise in academia. It's the place where you bring together the different disciplines and try to understand the world in a holistic fashion. And you have demonstrated today why everyone here should support the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So, on that happy commercial note.
That's a great ending.
Thank you. Thank you.